Hello everyone, my name is Rachel Harding and I am a postdoc at the University of Toronto, and I'm here today because we are talking about the Canadian Open Neuroscience Platform, or the CONP. I am co-chair on the Communications Committee for the CONP, and I'm joined today by my other co-chair, Nikola. Hello Nikola.
Hi, Rachel. My name is Nikola Stikov, a researcher at the Montreal Heart Institute and also professor at École Polytechnique at the University of Montreal. And my area of research is quantitative magnetic resonance imaging. How's everything in Toronto these days?
Things in Toronto are good. It's very cold, but that means that I have more time to spend on projects outside the lab rather than going cycling and swimming all the time as I do in the summer. So I have some more time to dedicate to the CONP, which is going to be nice, actually. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I ran away from the cold weather. I'm currently in Macedonia, so that means more sun for me, but I'll pay the price when I'm back in Montreal in January.
It's always a fun time to be in Montreal.
Exactly. But in the meantime, we have a couple of initiatives to get off the ground, one of which is this series of podcasts.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was pretty much your idea. You said that it would be a cool thing to do, and I agree. But I'm also pretty scary with how it's going to come out because we've never done this before.
Oh, it makes it exciting, I think, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you like podcasts? Do you listen to them quite a bit?
Yeah, I do, actually. Whenever I'm doing a lot of experiments, so I do a lot of protein purification, which involves quite a lot of time with my hands inside a cold box trying to extract precious samples. And so a lot of that I will end up listening to a variety of different podcasts. Some of them like comedy, some of them like current affairs. But I actually, I'm more and more interested in some of the popular science podcasts and some of the more professional science podcasts. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how ours turns out and how we'll compete in the iTunes podcast charts with everyone else.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I feel like it's a crowded field, and there's quite a lot of excellent scientists doing this. Hopefully, the unique angle that we bring is that, it's a chance for lots of Canadian scientists to voice their opinion on open science. And then, going forward, if this initiative gains traction, maybe we get a chance to talk to other open science advocates worldwide and hopefully, keep up the conversation about open science, bring it to a broader audience.
Absolutely. I think there's so many really cool open science, particularly open neuroscience projects happening in Canada, that it's going to be really fantastic to be able to showcase some of those in a podcast, and also bring sort of international attention to some of the really cool and sort of cutting edge initiatives that are happening here.
Now, given that we have to start somewhere, maybe the two of us can say a little bit about what aspects of open science we practice and why we think Canada can take the lead in this field.
Sure. So perhaps I'll get started. So I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Structural Genomics Consortium, run the Huntington's Disease Research Program. There's just a very small team of people doing some really cool work, Huntington protein. All of that work is published through an open lab notebook where all the data is made available in as close to real time as possible. And we also do a
little bit more about open lab notebooks. I know that quite a few people are doing it, and I'm just not sure how familiar people are with the concept.
Sure. So the SGC has always been a strong supporter of electronic lab notebooks. And I think when you talk to any scientist about how many stacks of paper notebooks they have with data and critical information hidden away in them, paper notebooks are obviously not something that's very 21st century. And so essentially for us, all it is transferring our electronic lab notebook, but publishing that on the web. And so we use a platform called Zenodo, which is a repository for all kinds of different data. And then anyone, anywhere in the world can read our lab notebooks. And we link through to a blog where we try and have a sort of lay summary or a summary that generalizes the experiments that we're doing. And so this is kind of a cool scientific outreach aspect to the project as well. And the central sort of ethos of the whole project is that if we share science more quickly, then we can get science done more quickly, and we stop wasting time and having multiple levels of redundancy for no purpose. And it kind of helps us to create a more collaborative ethos within the fields that we're working in. So that's really cool.
Yeah, no, this transparency some people might say is a double-edged sword in the sense that, people are worried if you put your data out there, if you describe your experiments in detail, might you get scooped? And, is that something that worries you? And, is there a message you might want to give to people that are considering doing open lab notebooks?
I think the scooping thing is something that we hear about a lot, but ultimately, folks give talks, they give poster presentations all the time with unpublished data, and this isn't really that different. And the facts, I found that by sharing your work earlier, you get so much more feedback from different members of the community, because by sharing, you kind of create this, it becomes a two-way conversation where other people want to share back with you. And so then what I found is quite nice is that that's helped me do my experiments more quickly, because I'm able to problem solve much more quickly.
And you're under pressure because people are waiting.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a pressure aspect to it, but no, I don't think it's really an issue. And I think also in some ways you're kind of marking your territory as well, because people know like, oh, this is what Rachel's researching at this place. And scientists are generally quite nice people. Like, they're not going to deliberately come in and kind of evilly scoop you and just take everything you've done. And I mean, essentially as well, that all the data is, it is open, but it's still copyrighted. Like, a Creative Commons license is still a form of copyright, and we have a Creative Commons attribution license on all of our content, which means that if anyone does use our work, they have to cite us. And, I'm yet to begin any legal proceedings against anyone who hasn't cited me, but it is something that could technically be done. So, yeah, something to bear in mind at least.
Are there limitations to what you share or what you can share?
I think the main limitation is my time in terms of writing it up. And I think this past couple of months actually have been quite tricky. I've had like a lot of travel, also had a lot of like fun family visitors from the UK, which has been taking up some of my time, which I'm more than happy for. But yeah, so it's more just focusing on getting the science done is always then the number one priority. Like, at the end of the day, open science is great, but I have to prioritize actually doing my experiments. And so then the open notebook is always going to be second fiddle to that. So that is the main limitation. And from all the other folks at the SGC who run open notebooks, I think this is the most common thing that we hear about, is making sure that you're setting aside the time to write it. And actually the writing doesn't really take that long, and you definitely get faster at doing it the more you're doing it. Like, it would take me less than half an hour to write up one experiment, but yeah, it's just like mentally blocking out that time in your schedule can be quite challenging sometimes.
How many people in your in your surrounding in Toronto, but also in your field, are doing this?
In Toronto at the moment, there's maybe 6, 7 or 8 of us who are doing that. Mostly postdocs, but a couple of master's students as well, which is really cool. And actually, that's a really cool aspect of it. So a master's student that I'm sort of co-supervising is running an open notebook. And for her, every time that before she uploads everything, she sends it to me, and then I read it through and just check that how everything's looking. And it's like a really amazing learning exercise, because basically she's getting feedback on her scientific writing, her interpretation of data every single week in a written form. And so I think it's really helped her like learn a lot of the methods and improve her writing skills. But in our sort of larger community, I think there's maybe 20 folks who are doing things at the moment, which is kind of cool. And that's all across the world. So we have people in Sweden. I think we're actually going to be having some people from Montreal soon, which is really exciting.
Cool.
So I'm going to give a talk at the Montreal Neurological Institute in December to tell them all about open notebooks and how they should all jump on our bandwagon. So yeah, it's really nice actually. And I think that we're going to have some from SGC Brazil soon as well. So we're trying to span as many continents as possible.
Excellent. And you actually brought this to Canada from the UK. Is that correct?
This is actually an idea that really sparked with Alan Edwards, who runs the Structural Genomics Consortium here in Toronto. And he is always looking at how can we share data in more innovative ways, and how can we kind of push the boundaries of what is considered open science. Yeah, he thinks that a lot of open publication stuff, is very important, but it's also like very 20th century issues, and we should have worked all that stuff out by now. And let's think about the next level of things, like sharing things in real time and, really pushing what people consider to be the definition of open science. So it was a chat that I had with him that actually initiated this whole project. And he just came to me in my office and said, oh, I think you should just share your electronic lab notebook online, just publish it every week. Yeah, it won't take you any extra time, Rachel, because you're doing that anyway when you have to write everything up for the SGC. So yeah, just be click of a button, done and dusted, and let's see what comes out of it. And so that's essentially what we did. And yeah, it's been incredibly fruitful. And, you know, it'd be really great to have more people share in the success of the Open Notebook projects. Yeah, so Nikola, how about you tell us a little bit about your role in open science and what you're doing in your own research?
So I'm currently a professor of electrical engineering at École Polytechnique at the University of Montreal, and also a researcher at the Montreal Heart Institute. I spent a lot of time, especially in my early years of research, not really publishing. And this was, you know, starting from 2005, 2006, when I started my PhD. My first paper was published in 2011, 2 years after I finished my PhD. And it was partially a conscious decision. I grew up in a lab that really promoted open science in many ways, but also promoted slow science. I was never under any pressure to publish. And after my first scientific conference, I presented my abstract, and I went back to my supervisor. I said, so, you know, do we write this up? And this is John Pauly at Stanford University. He's a renowned scientist, ISMRM gold medal winner. And he said, well, you should calculate the opportunity cost of publishing this. And I really didn't know what he meant. So, you know, I had to look it up, what is opportunity cost, come back to him and tell him, John, I calculated the opportunity cost. This abstract is very simple, easy to reproduce. I really don't think it's worth writing a paper about it. And he said, okay. And then I asked him, so what should I do next? And he said, oh, I don't know, just find something that interests you. So then it took me about 3 years to find something that interests me. And during that time, I was always following the state of academic publishing and the way the business is run, but also the way that scientists are under pressure to publish papers. So I decided, you know what, I have the freedom, I will take my time. And things worked out well. Eventually, I did a postdoc at McGill, got a couple of papers under my belt, had a lot of problems during job interviews because always people were asking, where are your publications? And fortunately, a couple of people throughout my career took a chance on me. And now that I'm faculty, I try to push this same idea of, you know what, not every work deserves a 10-page PDF. And I feel like a lot of the current modes of publication are really outdated. A 10-page PDF is really just part of the story. So my work is a lot about publishing data, publishing software, and bottom line, improving the way scientists communicate. So I ended up running a couple of scientific blogs when I became faculty. I joined the editorial board of a journal, Magnetic Resonance in Medicine, and I do a lot of scientific outreach for them. I founded the blog of the Organization for Human Brain Mapping. And more I do this, I realize that there is a thread, which is science communication is more than outreach. Science communication is more than PR, and it's definitely more than a 10-page PDF. So in my work, I try to fill in the blanks. I try to push a lot, publishing code, publishing data, making it easy for people to reproduce other people's findings by sharing Jupyter notebooks, executing them in the cloud. So I think there is a common thread, which is a frustration with the way that science is done at the moment and has been done for many years, and trying to innovate the way we communicate, be it our data or our code, or just the summaries of our work, which is very rarely shared with a lay audience.
I think that's really interesting because I do wonder how, if there was no funding pressures to publish manuscripts, and if that was sort of taken completely off the list of requirements for receiving external funding, like how much people would actually publish, like, and why would you not just share your data instead? Or whether you'd publish in a kind of much more informal manner and, you know, in a kind of preprint, but kind of pre-preprint where everything's just a data note and then something about it. And then that's how you share your information. So,
well, in a way, that's how science communication used to work. You know, before the printing press, people would write letters, and then, you know, they would get together and they would read their letters aloud. These are the transactions of the Royal Society. Now, when the printing press came about, the first academic journal actually preceded the first newspaper. The London Gazette came out in 1666, and I believe the transactions of the Royal Society came out a year before, 1665. So there was a level of intimacy and immediacy to the way people were doing their science. Something got lost along the way, and I guess the printing press helped. It was easier to publish a lot more and disseminate it more quickly. But it was really, I believe, the latter half of the 20th century when things kind of got off the rails and pressure to publish was much bigger. If you take a look at Peter Higgs, who's the father of the Higgs boson,
Yep.
He has an H-index of 11. He's been quoted saying, if I were looking for a job today, I would have a hard time because I wouldn't be considered productive enough. Now, science is getting way more collaborative. There's big data. There's lots more things that deserve sharing and publishing with the world. But I do believe that people are writing and publishing too much and not really reading enough, just because it's very difficult to keep up. I am a proponent of slow science, not only open science, but slow science. It served me well in my career, and I try to practice what I preach. I do believe that what we put out is high quality, and hopefully it results in changing of the culture one step at a time.
Yeah, I think this culture shift as well is also about a move to the reproducibility of a lot of the science that is published. And I always remember going to my first ever journal club as a PhD student and just being like horrified at the way that people rip into each other's papers and just say, well, this is all obviously like not good data, and this is wrong, and this is wrong. And it's just like, it just seems like the whole system is very broken, and either people can't reproduce each other's data. There's no recourse really if you find something that's not super reproducible, or you think there's something slightly erroneous in the paper or the manuscript. And I do wonder how much of that comes from the pressure that people are under to just get all their data together as quickly as possible, wrap it up into a story and publish it in this very prescribed format, which doesn't actually fit a lot of the data that we're collecting in the lab.
And, there is this unwritten rule, somewhere maybe it's written, of 3 papers for a PhD thesis, but, very little emphasis on giving credit for properly documenting your research and, making your data available. So whenever I give talks and I advocate this slow science approach, people are like, well, it's worked out for you, but, our students need to publish, and, we need to get grants, and unfortunately, granting agencies count the publications. And what I say is, well, these days, lots of things can be counted as a publication. So rather than ask students to salami slice their work into 3 PDFs, why not make one of their papers a data paper, another of their papers a software/code paper, and a third paper, the actual summary of the work that reads somewhere between a research article and a review of what's been done in the PhD thesis. I feel like there is a way to circumvent this pressure to just put out 3 10-page PDFs to get a PhD thesis, but there needs to be a change in culture so that publications of data and software are properly cited, credited, and contribute to promotions and funding decisions. I do see this change coming. I really feel like it's gotten way easier for people to get credit for all this work that goes behind the scenes. And your project, I guess, is a testament to that. You have citable blog posts that can be actually shared even before publication comes out.
One of the things I actually found really interesting with the open notebook work is how specific disease funders and funding agencies, most of which are charities, are so on board with the open science movement and the open data sharing. They honestly could not care less if you have 4 first author papers in Nature. All they care about is achieving their goal, which is, understanding the disease that they are advocating for, or trying to find therapies for the disease. And so for the Huntington's disease charities, there's a huge amount of emphasis on the way that your data is shared, how you collaborate with other people in the field, how you generate resources that other people in the field can use, whether those are like physical things or software or data sets. And, you talk about this and everyone's like, oh, well, yeah, obviously that makes sense because that's what their remit is. And it's like, then why would our remit be anything else? Like, I don't understand. It's not a prestige-driven model. It's just about getting the science done as quickly as you can. And I think that it's really interesting and quite eye-opening, actually.
Well, I feel that, publishers are a little behind on the technology because, sure, there are certain venues when you could be publishing your data and your code, but not that many.
Mm.
So, the publishing business is so big that it's really difficult to add data and code to each of these papers that are coming out. I feel like there's a need for a different avenue that will be able to support that kind of big science publishing. And I do believe that part of the problem is you cannot require modern publishers to support all of this additional peripheral data and code sharing without really changing the infrastructure. So I do see a potential there. A couple of publishers are really trying hard to make it easy on people to publish their notebooks and to make their code easily executable on the web. But it's still in its infancy. These efforts will take, one, advocacy, and two, infrastructure that can support that kind of big data-driven science.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting how much is happening and is moving forward, even in the last couple of years. I mean, the way that now that certain search engines will index things like preprints, which before never happened. If you go through any kind of scholarly search engine, you only ever see the final ever published manuscript. Whereas now there are loads of ways that you can easily tap into finding preprints or abstracts from conferences all together in one place. And just a lot of the technology that goes into doing that is really cool and exciting, and definitely encourages people to share more openly, because as long as people can find your data and find your publication, that's a priority for a lot of people. So things are definitely moving in the right direction, but yeah, more needs to be done. That's absolutely true.
And maybe, the last piece of this puzzle is the peer review process, which is currently really not transparent. And, when I was a student, I would read a paper, it would be very difficult to evaluate how important is this paper, because it's presented to you as something that, is the truth. You don't really see the conversation that went in the background before that paper was published. I've always said that I would love to read the reviews. I don't care if they're anonymous or not, as long as I know what the reviewers had to say about a paper. And people like reading comments. People even read comments on YouTube and Facebook. It's really just the scientific papers where, we're not really reading each other's comments. So when something is up as a preprint, that's great. But hopefully people actually comment on it. And then you get some kind of either pre-publication or post-publication peer review, so we can form an opinion about the work that incorporates all the stuff that the expert reviewers said. I think that without that, there's not going to be much of an incentive for people to be putting out the preprints. They will be waiting for the actual publication before they can share it with the world. But if they notice that people are paying attention, that people are interacting, that people are giving them constructive feedback on how to improve their work, I really feel that's going to raise the value of the preprint and maybe contribute to an ongoing peer review process that doesn't stop at the moment of publication.
I think you're right to draw the parallels between the way that we review scientific literature and the way that we review in sort of short comment form all other internet content. And at the end of the day, I don't see why it should be that much different. I think the main issue is that you kind of highlighted there is the anonymity of it, and the fact that by having an open review process and an open commenting process, you are going to immediately create an environment that's not as inclusive for some groups of people as it is for others, whether those are people who are earlier on in their career, or they're women, or they happen to be from a university that's considered more lowbrow, or whatever that might be. I think one of the really important things about open science is that it's a really inclusive environment. Like, open science is for everyone. It's not for just the scientific elites in their ivory towers. And I think that's a kind of underlying current that we have to be really sure about. For me, so much about open science is about the equity of information and making sure that people, irrespective of who they are, where they are, which university they attend or not, everyone has equal access to information so that they can then act on it in whatever way that they want to. But we have to always remember that there are a lot of inequities within these systems at the moment.
Absolutely. And I feel like, this conversation is really contributing to changing the culture, but we also need to, have a couple of good examples of open science and encourage people to practice open science and publish openly before we can have bigger buy-in from the general scientific community. So a couple of good examples can really go a long way. I always tell a story about Jonas Salk, who invented the polio vaccine. And they asked him why he didn't patent it. And he said, well, you cannot patent the sun. It's something that is already out there and is waiting to be discovered. So I feel like this ethic is still alive, and lots of people are doing very good open science. And I guess it's our job to highlight that and make the rest of the community aware that there are very good and even profitable way of practicing.
100%. And I think a lot of that as well is going back to the original and kind of the root reason why most people become a scientist. Most people do not become a scientist because they want to publish in Nature. Most people become a scientist because they want to discover things or make a change or like help develop medicines or whatever it might be. And I think kind of tapping back into people's original motivations for being involved in scientific research is a good way that probably you can do that. And that's a great example that you just gave there.
So given that we're on the communications committee together, we haven't really spoken about the communications channels that are becoming more and more popular, and that is social media. How important do you think social media is for promoting open science?
I think social media, as much as it can be a very sort of siloed arena in which to share information, you can reach more people than you would by other more traditional means, I think. And I think because it's something that is generally very accessible to people, you just need an internet connection and then basically you're there with almost any device. Then I think, there is a kind of equity as well in the way that you can share information through social media, and you can do outreach as well through social media. I think there's obvious downsides in the way that, those spaces aren't as safe or as comfortable for some people than others. And there are certain voices which shout more loudly. But nonetheless, I think that's something that is slowly maybe changing. I don't know, maybe I'm just over optimistic.
Well, there's always the potential for abusing it. And, fake news is so much on people's radar at the moment. Social media is particularly bad at that, or very good at spreading fake news. But I guess, we as scientists taking the lead and really trying to do a better job of explaining what we do without the filter of journalists might go a long way towards giving scientists more validity in this very uncertain age. Everything that we do in CONP is really driven by scientists for scientists, and maybe we can reach a broader audience if more of us take on an advocacy role and start feeling more comfortable with new media to get the word out.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think a huge part of being a scientist is communicating your ideas. And I think you should be able to do that to a range of audience. I think that's a really important skill that is not necessarily developed in the way that we're trained. And that's actually one of the things I found with the open notebooks is kind of having to take a step back and think about, how would I explain this to someone who isn't an expert in protein biochemistry? Like, how do I explain to them what I did this week in the lab? It's actually like a really interesting exercise, and it gives you a very different perspective on the value of the work that you're doing, and having that connection with a greater audience also makes you see how your work fits into the larger machine that the scientific academic science is. So yeah, definitely some good perspective to be done from that as well.
I guess lots of work to be done, and hopefully this podcast gets some conversations going. We hope that people will tune in, and we would love to get feedback about topics that we should be covering in the coming weeks.
Yeah, absolutely.